Okay, so we'll start off with our first shape, which has 2 points within the circle. So because there are 2 points, we start from our first point, which is A, and we draw a line to B, which is 1 pen movement, which means that Z equals 1. And because if we were to start from B and move to A, it would be the same movement. That doesn't count, so that's it. So that is the only equation, if you like, for this shape. Moving on to our next shape, which has 3 sides, we would start at A when there is a gap of 1, move to B, and then through to C, and then back to A, which means that every point is covered with a gap of 1. And then if we were to have a gap of 2, we would move from A to C, then from C to B, and then from B back to A, which means that the shape is repeated, but in a reversed fashion. So these are the 2 different equations. So the first one is with a gap of 1, and the second one is with a gap of 2, and they both have 1 pen movement. Looking at our third example, which has 4 points within the circle, we can see that with a gap of 1, it creates a square going from A to B to C to D, and then back to A again, which has 1 pen movement. With a gap of 2, we'd go from A to C, and then if we were to go back, if we were to move 2 from C, we'd go back to A, which means that doesn't count, which means we need to move to our pen again to start from B and move from B through to D, which can't be repeated from B back to B. So that's our second movement, which is represented in the blue pen here. And then our next movement with a gap of 3 is almost the reverse of when there's a gap with 1. So we'd go from A, skip B and C, and go through to D, and then D from A, B, back to C. C would skip D and A and go back to B, and so on from there. Our example with 5 sides, we'd start at A with a gap of 1, and it go from B through to C to D to E, and then back to A, which means that our pen movement only needs 1, which is represented there. Sorry, it's a bit blurry. When we have a gap of 2, we go from A through to C, through to E, through to B, through to D, and back to A, which is again 1 pen movement. And then in our blue, and that is represented with our blue pen. And then we can see with a gap of 3, it is just the reverse of when there's a gap with 2. So we'd go from A, skip B and C through to D, and so on, which is represented here, and that also has 1 pen movement. And then the reverse when we have a gap of 4 is just the reverse of when there's a gap with 1. So instead of going from A to B, we skip B, C, D, and just go straight to E, because we're moving in a clockwise fashion. And so it creates the same pentagon shape in reverse and only has 1 pen movement. Moving on to the circle with 6 points. When there's a gap of 1, we start with A and move to B through to C, to D, E, and F, which is 1 pen movement. The reverse of this is when there's a gap of 5, and in this case we would skip B, C, D, E, and we'd move to F. So even though the letters go round in a clockwise fashion, the lines move in an anti-clockwise fashion. When we have a gap of 2 and 4, it creates the blue pen shape here, which is 2 triangles. So when we start from A and have a gap of 2, we go from A to C, and then from C to E, and then C back to A, which is 1 pen movement. And then because B hasn't been touched yet, we move to B, which would be our second pen movement. Move from B to D, from D to F, and F back to B. So there are 2 pen movements for that one. And then when there is a gap of 4, it is just a repeat of those steps. So we'd start from A and skip 4, which means that we would go from A, skip B, skip C, skip D, and move straight to E. And then we'd go from E, skipping these, and going up to C, and so on. this one has, because it's got a gap of 3, which is half of 6, it means that when we move from A, skip 3, and go to D, if we were to move 3 from D, it would go back to A, which means that it would just be another repeat of the step, which means we have to move back to B, which would go to E, which can't be repeated, and then C through to F, which also can't be repeated, which means that the pen needs to be lifted 3 times in order to hit every point within that shape. Moving on to our next number of points, which is 7. So we start off with our general shape. So when there's a gap of 1, there is only 1 pen movement, which is the same for every shape when there's a gap of 1. And the reverse of this is when there is a gap of 6, which is represented by the black pen over here. And that moves in a reverse fashion. So we'd go from A and skip B through to E up till G, and that creates the reversed line. When there is a gap of 2, we'd move from A through to C, C through to E, E through to G, G through to B, B through to D, D through to E, and E back to A, which means that there is just 1 pen movement. And the reverse of this is when there is a gap of 5, and then when there is a gap of 3, it's also just 1 pen movement, and it goes from A to D, D to G, G to C, C to F, C to E, C to F, F to B, B to E, and E to A. So that's our 7-sided one. This is our 8-sided one, which I've split into 2 different bits. So our first shape is of course, it just has 1 pen movement, and the reverse of this is when there's a gap of 7, and then when there is a gap of 2, it creates this blue line, which means that the pen needs to be lifted twice. So my dog is barking. And then the reverse of this is when there is a gap of 6, and the pen needs to be lifted twice again, because it goes from A to C, C to E, E to G, G to A. I apologize for my dog. And then when there's a gap of 3, the reverse of this is when there's a gap of 5, and it's just 1 pen movement, so it goes from A to D, D to G, G to B, B to E, E to H, H to C, C to F, and F back to A. And the reverse of this is when there is a gap of 5. Because it's 8 and there's a different amount of sorry, I'll just start that again. When there is a gap of 4, it's half of the shape, which means that the line doesn't need to be repeated, because it just go back to the start, which means that there need to be 4 different starting points and 4 different pen lifts. And for our final shape, I split it into 2 different parts. So our first one, of course, has only 1 pen lift, and the reverse of this is when there is a gap of 8. And then when there is a gap of 2 and 7, there is also just 1 pen lift, which goes from A to C, C to E, E to G, G to I, and then I to B, B to D, D to F, F to H, and then H back to A. For our gap of 3 and for 6, 6 being the reverse of the 3, there are actually 3 pen lifts. And then for a gap of 4 and 5, there is also just 1 pen lift. So there are 3 different triangles for the gap of 3 and 6. Some of the patterns that I've noticed within this problem was that when 2 different y amounts are added together and equal x, which is the amount of points within the shape, they will have the same shape and therefore the same z total. And only when x is an even number is this rule not applied to one of the scores. So that score will always be half of x. So for example, we look at 8 here, and we see that it's an even number, and that means that one of the scores doesn't add up to the total of 8, which is x, which is why we have this kind of looking diagram. But then whereas we check our rule over here and we see that the similar shapes equal 8, which is x here. And that's just the patterns. Thank you.